Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping away from the clear, sunlit paths of history and venturing somewhere darker, somewhere deep in the old forests of Eastern Europe. We're not just looking at dates and battles tonight, we are chasing a shadow, a name that has been whispered for centuries with a unique blend of terror and respect. It's a name that belongs to a man who became a legend, a ruler whose methods were so brutal, so absolute, that his story was twisted into the fabric of nightmares. He was a prince, a crusader, and to many, a monster. But before we journey into that darkness, if this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Now, dim the lights. Let the world around you settle. Let's travel back to a land of warring empires and haunted castles to uncover the story of the man who would one day inspire the tale of Dracula. Before we can understand the man, we must first understand the land that shaped him. Let us imagine, for a moment, the world of 15th century Wallachia. This is not the grand stone and marble empire of Rome, nor the glittering court of France. This is a different kind of place. A rugged, fiercely independent land of dark, sprawling forests and mountains that scrape against the clouds, their peaks often lost in a cold, heavy mist. Think of a land carved by ancient rivers, where small villages huddle in the valleys, their wooden homes thatched with straw, the smoke from their fires curling slowly into the damp air. Life here for the common person is tied to the seasons and to survival. It is a life of back-breaking labor in the fields, of herding sheep through shadowy woods, of huddling close to the fire during the long, brutal winters. There is a deep folklore here, stories of spirits in the woods and monsters in the dark, a superstition born from the land itself, a land that is as beautiful as it is unforgiving. But more than its geography, Wallachia is defined by its position on the map. It is a crossroads of worlds, a Christian principality pressed uncomfortably between two colossal powers. To the north and west lies the formidable kingdom of Hungary, a Catholic powerhouse and a bastion of European chivalry. To the south, across the wide Danube River, looms the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire, a Muslim force led by ambitious sultans who see Europe not as a neighbor, but as a territory to be conquered. Wallachia is the shield, the buffer zone, the unfortunate land caught in the middle. Its rulers must be masters of diplomacy and war, constantly playing one empire against the other. Loyalty is a currency that changes value with the seasons. A prince might swear fealty to the Hungarian king one year, only to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan the next, all for the sake of survival. It is a land of spies, of assassins, of boyars, the wealthy nobles who would sell their prince to the highest bidder for a promise of more land or power. This is the world that Vlad was born into, not a kingdom of peace, but a permanent battleground, where trust was a fool's luxury and survival depended on being more ruthless than your enemies. Into this treacherous world, a new leader emerged, Vlad's father, a man known to history as Vlad II. He was not just a Wallachian prince. He was a man with connections. In 1431, the same year his famous son was born, Vlad II was inducted into a prestigious, semi-secret society, a monarchical chivalric order known as the Order of the Dragon. This wasn't just a club for noblemen. Founded by the King of Hungary, the Order of the Dragon was a serious affair with a deadly purpose to defend the cross and fight the enemies of Christianity, specifically the Ottoman Turks. Its members were kings, powerful dukes, and elite warriors, sworn to protect the faith and the borders of Christendom. As a symbol of his membership, Vlad II was given the right to use the emblem of a dragon, its tail curled around its neck, a symbol of both power and sacrifice. He was so proud of this honor that he took the dragon as his own title. In the Romanian language of the time, The word for dragon was Dracula. So, Vlad too became Vlad Dracul. The name wasn't meant to be frightening. To the people of Wallachia and the courts of Europe, it signified that their prince was a sworn defender of the faith, a crusader knight. He even had the dragon symbol minted onto his coins and painted on his banners. And as was the custom, his son, Vlad III, inherited a version of that name. In Romanian, adding an A to the end of a name often means son of. So, the son of Dracul became known as Dracula. Think about that for a moment. The most feared name in the history of horror did not begin with a vampire's bite or a pact with the devil. It began as a badge of honor. It meant son of the dragon. It was a promise, a legacy passed from a crusader father to his son, a symbol of a sacred duty to protect his people and his faith from the encroaching empire. The terrible irony is how that name, once a symbol of Christian chivalry, would one day become synonymous with the very darkness it was created to fight. The story of Vlad is the story of how the son of the dragon became a monster far more terrifying than the one on his father's emblem. That sacred duty, that title of son of the dragon, was put to the test almost immediately, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, perfumed halls of the Ottoman court. To be a ruler of Wallachia was to walk a tightrope. Vlad Dracul, despite his oath to the Order of the Dragon, was forced to play a dangerous double game. To appease the immensely powerful Sultan Murad II, he had to pay tribute and, at times, even fight alongside the Ottomans. The Sultan, however, was a shrewd and suspicious ruler. He demanded more than just gold and soldiers as proof of loyalty. He demanded a guarantee that could not be easily broken. In 1442, when Vlad III was just a boy of 11, his father was summoned by the Sultan. Trusting the Sultan's word, he brought two of his sons with him, young Vlad and his even younger brother, Radu. It was a trap. Upon their arrival, Vlad Dracul was imprisoned, and his sons were taken as political hostages. Though their father was eventually released to rule Wallachia once more, the price of his freedom was leaving his children behind. For Vlad and Radu, their lives were now forfeit, held as collateral to ensure their father's obedience. Imagine this from the perspective of a young boy. One day, you are a prince in your own land, however rugged. The next, you are a pawn in a gilded cage. The Ottoman court was a world of contradictions. It was a center of learning, of art, of sophisticated philosophy. Vlad was given an excellent education. He learned to speak fluent Turkish, studied the Quran, and was trained in the arts of war and horsemanship alongside the Sultan's own sons. He was surrounded by luxury silks, intricate carvings, lavish meals. But beneath this glittering surface was a constant, unspoken threat. Every day was a lesson in power. He saw how the Sultan dealt with those who failed him. He learned that mercy was often seen as weakness, and that fear was the most reliable tool of governance. He saw absolute power in its most raw and effective form. For his younger brother, Radu, this world was seductive. Radu was handsome, charming, and he adapted, eventually becoming a friend and favorite of the future Sultan, Mehmed II. For Vlad, however, it was poison. He was proud, defiant, and filled with a simmering rage. He hated the Ottomans for what they had done to his family and his country. He hated the constant humiliation of being a hostage. Every day of his gilded captivity was another lesson in hatred, a slow burning fire that forged his will into something hard and unforgiving. The boy who entered the Ottoman court would not be the man who left it. The years he spent there taught him everything he needed to know about his enemy's mind and methods, and it planted a seed of vengeance that would one day bloom into a forest of horrors. After years in captivity, the political winds of Wallachia shifted once again. In 1447, Vlad's father, Vlad Dracula, and his older brother, Mircea, were brutally murdered. They fell victim to a rebellion of the Wallachian boyars, the very nobles they were meant to rule, who were backed by the Hungarian regent, John Hunyadi. They buried the prince alive and blinded his heir before killing him. This act of bloody treason left a power vacuum, and the Ottoman Sultan saw his opportunity. He had the perfect puppet to place on the throne, the young, vengeful Vlad, still his hostage. And so, in 1448, with the backing of an Ottoman army, Vlad III, the son of the dragon, tasted power for the first time. He was just 17 years old. But this first reign was a flicker, a brief and violent spark that was extinguished almost as soon as it was lit. He sat on the throne of Wallachia for a mere 2 months. His rule was not secured by the loyalty of his people or the strength of his own army, but by the Turkish soldiers who had installed him. To the powerful boyars who had just betrayed his father, he was nothing more than the Sultan's pawn, a temporary inconvenience. The Hungarian regent, John Hunyadi, who had orchestrated his father's demise, was not about to let an Ottoman-backed prince rule on his border. He immediately moved against Vlad, installing his own preferred candidate on the throne. Outmatched and with no real support base within his own country, Vlad was forced to flee. His first taste of power was the taste of bitter defeat and profound humiliation. But it was also a critical lesson. It taught him that foreign backing was fleeting and unreliable. It taught him that the boyars, the land-owning noble class of Wallachia, were not just political rivals. They were snakes in the grass, a treacherous and self-serving force that would sacrifice any ruler and the nation itself for their own gain. He realized that to rule Wallachia, truly rule it, he couldn't just govern the boyars. He would have to break them. This brief, failed reign solidified the convictions that had been hardening in him for years. The rage he felt toward the Ottomans was now matched by a deep, cold hatred for the internal enemies who had destroyed his family. He fled into exile, a prince with no throne, but he carried with him a crystal-clear vision of what he would do if he ever got the chance to return. There would be no more mercy. There would only be order, imposed with an iron will. For 8 long years, Vlad wandered in exile. He moved between the courts of Moldavia and Hungary, a landless prince, a guest with a deep and patient grudge. He was a shadow, watching from the sidelines as Wallachia churned through a succession of rulers, each one a puppet of either the Hungarians or the Ottomans. During this time, he wasn't idle. He honed his military skills, studied the shifting alliances of the region, and learned the bitter art of diplomacy from the position of a supplicant. He absorbed the strategies of his enemies and his temporary allies, all the while waiting. His patience was that of a predator, coiled and still, knowing its moment would come. That moment arrived in 1456. The geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe had shifted dramatically. 3 years earlier, in 1453, the unthinkable had happened. The great city of Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christendom for 1,000 years, had fallen to the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II. The fall of the city sent a shockwave of profound fear throughout Europe. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a distant threat. It was a conquering force at the gates of the West. The Kingdom of Hungary, now sharing a long and hostile border with the Ottomans, was desperate. They needed a fierce, uncompromising, and staunchly anti-Ottoman leader to hold the line in Wallachia. And there, waiting in the wings, was Vlad. The man they had once ousted was now their best, and perhaps only, viable candidate. The Hungarian regent, John Hunyadi, the very man who had orchestrated the overthrow of Vlad's father, now gave Vlad his military backing to reclaim the Wallachian throne. The cruel irony of this alliance was surely not lost on Vlad, but he was a pragmatist. He would take help from any quarter if it served his ultimate goal. With Hungarian support, he marched into Wallachia. The ruling prince at the time, Vladislav II of the rival dynasty clan, was a Hungarian appointee who had grown too comfortable and perhaps too friendly with the Ottomans for Hungary's liking. When Vlad's forces entered the country, Vladislav fled. But Vlad was not one to leave loose ends. He pursued his rival, and in a final, personal confrontation, he reportedly killed Vladislav in one-on-one combat. At the age of 25, Vlad III, Dracula, son of the dragon, was Prince of Wallachia once again. This time, there would be no 2-month failure. This time, he came not as a boy propped up by foreign soldiers, but as a hardened man with a plan, a vision forged in the fires of exile and fueled by a cold, calculated fury. His first priority was absolute, unquestionable control. He understood better than anyone that his throne was balanced on a knife's edge. To the south, Sultan Mehmed II, his former captor, watched him with deep suspicion. To the north, the Hungarians supported him, but only as long as he remained a useful tool against the Turks. And within his own borders, the boyars were already whispering, already plotting, their loyalties as flexible as ever, ready to betray him just as they had his father. Vlad knew he could not build a stable kingdom on such rotten foundations. Before he could face the external threat of the Ottomans, he first had to cleanse his own house. He began a systematic purge of anyone with a competing claim to the throne, primarily the powerful dynasty clan. There were no trials, no negotiations, no honorable exiles. They were simply eliminated, their land seized, their power erased. He moved his court from the more accessible city of Targovice to the more remote and defensible Curtea de Argis, a clear signal that he was digging in for a long fight against enemies both foreign and domestic. But killing his dynastic rivals was only the beginning. The real source of Wallachia's chronic instability, the real cancer within the state, was the boyar class. They were the ones who had murdered his father and blinded his brother. Their greed and treachery had kept the country weak and vulnerable for generations. And Vlad had a special plan for them. A plan that would become the first and most enduring of his dark legends. An event that would signal to all of Wallachia and the world that a new kind of ruler had arrived, one who would not tolerate dissent, who would not forgive betrayal, and who would build his new order on a foundation of absolute, unshakable terror. With his rivals for the throne eliminated, Vlad turned his cold gaze upon the boyars. He knew their history. He knew their loyalty was a commodity, sold to the highest bidder, be it the Hungarians or the Ottomans. These were the men who had grown rich and powerful while Wallachia bled, the men who had orchestrated the murder of his own father and brother. He saw them not as the nobility of his country, but as a parasitic class, a sickness that had to be cured if the nation was to survive. And Vlad intended to perform the surgery himself. The story of what happened next has been told and retold for centuries, becoming a cornerstone of his terrifying legend. It is known as the Easter Feast. While some historical details may have been embellished over time, the core of the event speaks to the calculated and theatrical nature of Vlad's cruelty. In the spring of 1457, following his consolidation of power, Vlad invited hundreds of the boyars and their families to his court for a grand Easter celebration. The nobles arrived in their finest silks and furs, expecting a traditional feast. a chance to size up the new ruler, to flatter him, and to begin the subtle dance of politics and power. They saw a young prince, and perhaps they underestimated him, believing he could be managed just like the others before him. They were catastrophically wrong. As the feast began, Vlad moved among them, his presence casting a pall over the festivities. He was not there to celebrate. He was there to pass judgment. According to the chronicles, he stood before the assembled nobility and asked them a simple question. How many princes has this land seen in your lifetime? The boyars, confused, began to answer. Some had lived through 5 reigns. Some, the older ones, could remember 7 or 10 or even more, rattling off the names of rulers they had served and, in many cases, betrayed. As they spoke, they unknowingly condemned themselves. For with each name they listed, they confirmed the chronic, treacherous instability that Vlad so despised. When they had finished, Vlad's demeanor turned from stone to ice. He revealed his true purpose. He accused them, all of them, of being responsible for the nation's weakness, for the endless cycle of assassination and betrayal. He held them personally accountable for the murder of his father and brother. The feast hall fell silent, the air thick with terror as the boyars realized this was not a celebration, but an inquest. Then the verdict was delivered. The soldiers, his loyal mercenaries, stormed the hall. The accounts diverge on the precise details, but they all agree on the horror. The older boyars and their families, the ones deemed most responsible for the decades of turmoil, were rounded up right there in the courtyard. Stakes, sharpened and waiting, were brought forward. One by one, they were impaled, their death agony serving as a gruesome spectacle for the survivors. But for the younger, healthier boyars and their families, Vlad had a different fate in mind. Their wealth and status were stripped away in an instant. They were chained together and force-marched 50 miles up the Arges River to the crumbling ruins of an old cliffside fortress. There, they were told they would work until the fine clothes they wore rotted from their bodies. They were given a new, singular purpose to rebuild the fortress, stone by stone, transforming it into an impregnable stronghold that would forever be known as his true seat of power, Poenari Castle. Many died from exhaustion and exposure, their noble hands raw and bloody from the punishing labor. The Easter feast was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. In one single, brutal act, Vlad had shattered the power of the boyar class. He had eliminated the old guard, terrified the survivors into submission, and demonstrated to all of Wallachia that loyalty to him was not a choice, but a necessity for survival. The message was unmistakable. The old ways were dead. And the price for opposing the son of the dragon was not just death, but unimaginable horror. The purge of the boyars at the Easter feast was not merely an act of revenge. It was a foundational step in Vlad's grand project of state building. With the old nobility either dead or enslaved, he had cleared the way to build a new Wallachia, one forged in his own image and centered on his absolute authority. A key part of this transformation was geographic. He needed a capital that was not just a seat of government, but a symbol of his power and a fortress against his enemies. Historically, the Wallachian court had been somewhat nomadic, but the city of Targovist had served as the primary capital. While strategically located in the heart of the Wallachian plain, it was also open and accessible, making it vulnerable to the swift cavalry raids of the Ottoman army. More importantly, it was the city of the boyars, its halls and chambers filled with the ghosts of their plotting and the memory of his father's murder. Vlad needed a fresh start, a place that was unequivocally his. His eyes turned to the mountains, to the remote and rugged landscape of the Argies River Valley, and specifically to the ruins of a small, crumbling fortress perched precariously on a sheer cliff face. This was Poenari. It was here that he had sent the surviving boyars from the Easter feast, turning them from pampered nobles into a terrified workforce. Under the whips of his taskmasters, they toiled relentlessly. They hauled stone from the riverbed below, mixed mortar, and rebuilt the fortress from its foundations up. It was a brutal and grueling task. The legend says they worked until their fine clothes disintegrated and they were left naked and bleeding, a testament to Vlad's unforgiving will. What emerged from their suffering was more than just a castle. It was a statement. Poenari Castle became Vlad's true citadel, an eagle's nest that was nearly impossible to attack. With its high walls clinging to the rock and a commanding view of the entire valley, it was a declaration of his intent. He was no longer a prince of the open plains, reliant on the shifting loyalties of his nobles. He was a mountain king, secure in his impenetrable fortress. This move shifted the strategic center of Wallachia, anchoring his power in a place of natural strength and brutalist architecture. While he established Poenari as his ultimate redoubt, he also began to develop the city of Bucharest. At the time, Bucharest was little more than a fortified settlement, one of many in the region, but Vlad recognized its strategic potential. It was situated further south than Targovist, providing a better vantage point from which to monitor and counter Ottoman movements across the Danube. He issued an official document, the first of its kind, to mention the city by name on September 20th, 1459, solidifying his court's presence there. In doing so, he effectively founded the city that would one day become the capital of modern Romania. This dual focus on Poenari and Bucharest reveals the mind of a master strategist. Poenari was his fortress of fear and last resort, a place no enemy could easily touch. Bucharest was his forward operating base, his eye toward the empire he intended to defy. Together, they represented the two pillars of his rule: absolute internal security and relentless external vigilance. He was not just conquering his country, he was rebuilding it, laying down the stones of his new capital with the same cold, methodical precision he used to eliminate his enemies. Having broken the power of the nobility and secured his mountain fortress, Vlad turned his attention to the very soul of Wallachia itself. The country he inherited was not just politically unstable. It was, by his standards, morally bankrupt. Decades of inconsistent rule, foreign interference, and boyar corruption had created a land where law was a suggestion and crime was a way of life. Theft was rampant, merchants were regularly cheated, and the roads were unsafe for travelers. To Vlad, this was not just a social problem. It was a symptom of the same disease of indiscipline and decay that had rotted the boyar class. His solution was just as radical and just as brutal. He sought to impose a new kind of order on Wallachia, an absolute law. This wasn't a complex legal code with courts and lawyers. It was a simple, terrifyingly direct system based on one principle: that any crime, no matter how small, would be met with a punishment so severe that no one would ever dare to repeat it. His ultimate goal was to eradicate not just crime, but the very idea of it. He wanted to forge a new national character based on honesty, hard work, and above all, an abiding fear of his retribution. The primary tool for this social re-engineering was the same one he had used on the treacherous boyars the stake. Impalement became the standard punishment for a vast range of offenses. It was not reserved for murderers or traitors. A thief caught stealing a loaf of bread could find himself facing the same slow, agonizing death as a disloyal noble. This extreme application of capital punishment was a calculated choice. It was public, it was horrifying, and it was unforgettable. When a thief was impaled in the central square of a village, his lingering death served as a silent, powerful sermon to every person who saw it. The lesson was simple in Vlad's Wallachia. The price for a single loaf of bread could be your life. But his methods went beyond just impalement. He declared war on all forms of social decay. Laziness was considered a crime against the state. Peasants who neglected their fields or workers who were idle could be punished severely. Dishonesty in the marketplace was met with swift and painful consequences. A merchant who cheated a customer might be impaled or, according to some tales, have his hands cut off. Adultery, seen as a threat to the sacred family unit, was also punished with extreme prejudice, with tales of unfaithful wives being mutilated or executed in gruesome ways. It's crucial to understand that, in Vlad's mind, this was not senseless cruelty. It was a systematic campaign. He believed he was acting as a surgeon, cutting out the cancerous parts of society to save the whole. He was purging the nation of its weaknesses, its laziness, its dishonesty, making it strong from the inside out. He envisioned a Wallachia where every citizen was a productive, honest, and obedient part of the national machine. A country so orderly, so disciplined, that it could stand united and unbreakable against the might of the Ottoman Empire. This campaign was the domestic phase of his war. Before he could fight the Sultan, he had to conquer the hearts and minds of his own people, not by winning their love, but by commanding their absolute, terrified obedience. He was laying down a new foundation for his kingdom, not with stone and mortar, but with fear and blood. And as the stories of his brutal justice began to spread, they took on a life of their own, becoming dark legends that were as much a part of his rule as his castles and his armies. To understand Vlad's reign, we must, for a moment, look closer at his chosen instrument of power, the act that gave him his infamous title, the Impaler. It is a grim subject, but essential to understanding the particular brand of terror he wielded. The method was not his invention. Impalement was an ancient and brutal form of execution used by various cultures for centuries. But Vlad did not just use it, he perfected it. He turned it into a political tool, a form of psychological warfare, and an art of horror. So, what was it? Exactly the process, though barbaric, was often carried out with a grim and chilling precision. A large wooden stake, typically the height of a man or taller, was sharpened to a point. This point, however, was usually rounded and well oiled. This detail is crucial and speaks to the calculated cruelty of the method. A sharp, dagger-like point would pierce vital organs quickly, bringing a relatively swift death. That was not the goal. The rounded point was designed to push organs aside, not puncture them, ensuring the victim remained alive for as long as possible. The stake was inserted through the victim's body, most commonly through the rectum or vagina, and then carefully guided through the torso, exiting near the shoulder, neck, or mouth, narrowly avoiding the heart and other vital organs. The stake was then raised vertically, and the victim's own body weight would slowly pull them further down onto the stake, inch by agonizing inch. Death was never quick. It could take hours, sometimes even days. The cause of death was a combination of shock, dehydration, and blood loss from internal injuries. The victim was fully conscious for much of this ordeal, a living statue of suffering, displayed for all to see. This was the true genius of its horror. It wasn't just an execution. It was a performance. It provided a long, drawn-out public spectacle that allowed the message to sink in. A hanging is over in minutes, a beheading in seconds, but a man dying on a stake was a lesson that lasted an entire day or longer. Imagine the psychological effect on those who witnessed it. For the family of the victim, it was an unimaginable torment. For the community, it was a visceral and unforgettable warning. The sight of a body, or dozens of bodies, silhouetted against the sky on stakes, became a symbol of the prince's absolute power. It was a message that needed no translation. It communicated that the ruler was capable of inflicting a fate worse than a simple death. He could unmake a person, slowly, publicly, and artfully. Vlad applied this method to a horrifyingly broad array of people, not just enemy soldiers, but thieves, corrupt officials, unchaste women, and disloyal boyars. Sometimes, the victims were impaled in specific patterns or heights to signify their rank or the nature of their crime. This was not the work of a madman lashing out in rage. It was the work of a cold, rational mind using terror as a deliberate instrument of state policy. He understood that the fear of such a death would be a far more effective deterrent than any prison or fine. In Vlad's Wallachia, the stake was the ultimate symbol of the law, slow, inescapable, and absolute. As the fear of the stake solidified Vlad's power, stories of his brutal justice began to ripple through the towns and villages of Wallachia. These were not tales whispered in secret, but public knowledge. Morality plays where the lesson was always the same in Vlad's kingdom. There is no escape from the law. The most famous of these legends, repeated for centuries as the ultimate proof of his success, is the story of the Golden Cup. In the central square of his capital, Targovist, right next to a public well, Vlad placed a magnificent cup. It was exquisitely crafted and made of solid gold, a treasure of immense value. He left it there, unguarded, day and night, for anyone to use. Any traveler, from the richest merchant to the poorest peasant, was free to drink from the well using this priceless goblet. This was not an act of generosity. It was a test. It was a silent challenge to his people. In any other kingdom at the time, such an object would have been stolen within the hour. It was an irresistible temptation in a world filled with poverty and crime. But in Wallachia, the golden cup remained untouched. It sat by the well, gleaming in the sun, for the entirety of his reign. The chronicles claim that throughout all those years, not a single person dared to steal it. Why? Because every person who walked through that square knew the price of that cup. It wasn't its weight in gold. It was the certainty of an agonizing death. The image of the impaled thief was so deeply burned into the collective mind of the populace that the value of the gold simply vanished. All they could see when they looked at the cup was the shadow of the stake looming behind it. The risk was so absolute, the reward so meaningless in comparison, that the temptation itself died. The story of the golden cup became the ultimate symbol of the new Wallachia that Vlad was building. It represented a land completely purged of crime. A land where a purse of gold could be left on a public road and remain there undisturbed. A land where a lone woman could travel from one end of the country to the other without fear of being robbed or harmed. To the outside world, this might have seemed like a miracle, but to the people of Wallachia, it was a simple equation of terror. Vlad had achieved a level of public order that other rulers could only dream of, but he had purchased it with fear. The untouched golden cup was more than just a testament to the absence of theft. It was a monument to the effectiveness of his brutal, uncompromising will. It was a symbol of a society so perfectly controlled, so paralyzed by fear, that its citizens policed themselves. Every man, woman, and child became their own jailer, haunted by the specter of the prince's horrifying justice. Vlad's obsession with absolute honesty extended far beyond his own subjects. He was keenly aware that for Wallachia to prosper, it needed to be a safe and reliable place for foreign trade. The roads had to be secure, and the marketplaces had to be fair. He wanted to attract merchants from distant lands, but only if they were willing to conduct themselves according to his impossibly high standards. This led to another famous story, one that illustrates how he tested not only the honesty of his own people, but that of the visitors who came to do business in his domain. The story tells of an Italian merchant, likely from Genoa or Venice, who traveled to Targoviste with a wagon laden with valuable goods. Knowing of Vlad's reputation for maintaining order, the merchant was confident enough to leave his cart and his purse, which reportedly contained a large sum of 160 golden ducats, unattended in the street overnight. When he returned in the morning, he was pleased, but not surprised, to find that nothing had been touched. His goods were safe, and his money was exactly where he had left it. Relieved, the merchant went to seek an audience with the prince to praise him for the incredible security and honesty that reigned in his land. After counting his money in front of Vlad, however, he declared that exactly one coin was missing. When Vlad heard this, he assured the merchant that the thief would be found and punished. He then dismissed the merchant, telling him to leave his money behind and return later. Vlad already knew what had happened. He had secretly ordered one coin to be taken from the purse himself. It was a trap, a test of the merchant's own integrity. He had the thief who supposedly stole the coin immediately impaled. He then ordered his treasurer to return the merchant's money, but with an extra coin added to the original sum. When the merchant returned, he was given his purse. Upon counting the money, he discovered the deception. He found not the 9 coins he had reported missing one from, but 161 coins. The honest merchant immediately recognized the extra coin and returned to the prince, informing him of the error and returning the additional piece of gold. Vlad looked at the merchant with a cold, piercing gaze. He then revealed the entire scheme. He told the merchant that he had deliberately tested him. Had the merchant not returned the extra coin, had he chosen to remain silent and keep the small additional sum, he would have been impaled right alongside the thief. This story reveals a deeper layer of Vlad's philosophy. It wasn't enough for his people to be honest out of fear. He demanded that everyone who entered his realm, even esteemed foreign visitors, adhere to the same perfect, inflexible standard of integrity. It shows his deep-seated cynicism and his belief that all men were prone to corruption unless held in check by overwhelming terror. For Vlad, justice was a blade with two edges. One was for the common criminal who threatened the stability of his state. The other was for anyone, rich or poor, local or foreign, who failed his personal, absolute test of moral character. The message of the world was clear: if you come to Wallachia, you will be safe, but you will also be watched. Vlad's obsession with order was absolute, and it extended to every corner of his society. He saw his kingdom as a single body, and he believed any part of it that was unproductive or weak was a source of disease. In his eyes, this included not just criminals and traitors, but also those who could not contribute to the strength of the nation: the poor, the sick, the vagrant, and the beggar. To Vlad, their suffering was not a tragedy to be pitied, but a drain on the resources of his state, a blemish on the perfect, disciplined society he was trying to build. According to these German chronicles, Vlad decided to solve the problem of poverty and infirmity in Wallachia with a single, horrifying act of purification. He commanded his officials to conduct a census of all the vagrants, beggars, and chronically ill people in the land. He then sent out a grand invitation, summoning them all to a great feast at a specially constructed hall in Targoviste. He promised them a day without hunger or cold, a celebration in their honor where they would be treated with the dignity they had been denied. For the destitute of Wallachia, this was an unbelievable act of charity from their feared prince. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, gathered from all corners of the kingdom. They were crippled, blind, impoverished, and filled with a desperate hope. They hobbled into the great hall, where, as promised, a magnificent feast was laid out before them. They ate their fill and drank wine, many of them likely experiencing a level of comfort they hadn't known in years. As the feast wound down, Vlad himself appeared before them. He stood at the head of the hall and asked them a chilling question. Do you wish to be without cares, lacking nothing in this world? Eagerly, the crowd shouted their assent. Of course, that is all any of them wanted. Then, Vlad declared, I shall fulfill your wish. He turned and left the hall. As the doors were barred from the outside, the crowd began to stir uneasily. The soldiers, on Vlad's command, surrounded the wooden hall. They brought torches. The building was set ablaze. The sounds of celebration quickly turned into screams of terror and agony as the fire consumed the hall and everyone trapped within it. Vlad, it is said, watched the inferno from a safe distance, his expression impassive. His justification for this atrocity, as recorded by his enemies, was as cold as the act itself. He claimed he had not been cruel, but merciful. He had cleansed Wallachia of its burdens, ensuring that its resources would only go to the strong and productive. Furthermore, he argued that he had freed the victims themselves from a life of suffering, delivering them from their earthly cares, just as he had promised. Whether this event happened exactly as described is debated by historians. It is a story that serves the narrative of his enemies perfectly, painting him not as a stern lawgiver, but as a sadistic monster devoid of human empathy. But true or not, the legend of the burning feast became a powerful piece of the propaganda against him. It was a story that showed a man willing to sacrifice the weakest of his flock, not for the greater good, but for a terrifyingly cold and utilitarian vision of a perfect state. Vlad's crusade for an orderly society was relentless, and it targeted not just major crimes, but also personal failings that he considered detrimental to the state. In his view, a lazy citizen was as much a thief as a man who stole a purse, for they both robbed the nation of its potential. Dishonesty, in any form, was a poison that weakened the bonds of community and trust. His punishments for these moral infractions were just as severe and just as theatrical as his punishments for theft and murder, giving rise to a host of chilling folk tales. One such tale speaks of how he dealt with laziness. While traveling through his domain, Vlad once came upon a peasant working in a field. The man was dressed in simple, durable clothes, but his wife, who stood nearby, was wearing a shirt that was noticeably too short. Vlad stopped and questioned the man. He asked if the man's wife was skilled at spinning and weaving. The peasant, eager to praise his wife, assured the prince that she was. Vlad then pointed to the short shirt the woman was wearing and asked the man how this could be, if she was so skilled with thread. The peasant, terrified, stammered that he was poor and had not been able to provide her with enough flax to make a proper garment. Vlad dismissed his excuse. He saw not a poor man, but a lazy one. In a kingdom as fertile as Wallachia, he believed any man willing to work could provide for his family. He saw the short shirt not as a sign of poverty, but as a sign of indolence and neglect. As a lesson to the husband, and to all who witnessed it, Vlad had the woman impaled, decreeing that her lazy husband did not deserve her. He then found another woman in the village, one known for her diligence, and gave her to the horrified man as a new wife, with a stern warning, "Work hard, so that she shall not suffer the same fate." His intolerance for dishonesty extended to the most intimate parts of life. Adultery was seen not as a personal sin, but as a grave crime against social order, a betrayal that threatened the sanctity of the family unit, which he considered a cornerstone of his strong nation. The punishments were gruesome. An unfaithful wife might be publicly shamed and mutilated, perhaps having her nose cut off. In some of the more extreme German stories, it's claimed he would have the skin flayed from their bodies, or have them executed by forcing a red-hot iron stake through their bodies. These stories, whether literally true or embellished over time, served a vital purpose. They were cautionary tales that permeated every aspect of daily life. They taught the people of Wallachia that the prince's gaze was everywhere. He was not just a distant ruler concerned with armies and borders. He was a moral arbiter who scrutinized their work ethic, their honesty, and their marital fidelity. He was engineering a new type of citizen, industrious, truthful, and obedient, not through inspiration, but through the constant gnawing fear that any personal failing could lead to a horrific and public end. Every nail hammered, every thread spun, every word spoken was done under the shadow of the stake. Vlad was keenly aware of his grim reputation, not just within Wallachia, but across Christendom. He knew that tales of his brutal methods were spreading, carried by merchants, friars, and envoys. This story, popular in the chronicles, shows that he was not indifferent to how he was perceived, but that he judged the opinions of others by his own severe standards of truthfulness. The tale begins with two Catholic monks, traveling from a foreign land, who came to Vlad's court in Targovist. Knowing they would be traveling back to Western Europe, Vlad summoned them, for he wished to show them the proof of his particular brand of justice. He led them out into the courtyard, which on that day, as on most days, was a forest of stakes. Hundreds of bodies, in various states of decay, were displayed upon the sharpened thieves, murderers, and disloyal boyars, each one a testament to his unforgiving law. He then turned to the two monks and asked for their judgment. The first monk, trembling with fear and revulsion, could not contain his horror. He looked at the gruesome sight, then back at the cold-faced prince, and said, "You are a tyrant, a man of unimaginable cruelty. These people were God's children, and you have delivered them to a torment forbidden by heaven. You are a monster." The second monk, however, was more cunning, or perhaps more terrified. He had quickly assessed the situation and decided that flattery was the only path to survival. He bowed his head and said, "You, my prince, are an instrument of God. You are stern, yes, but you are just. You punish the wicked to protect the righteous. You are bringing order where there was chaos and security where there was fear. Your justice is a service to heaven." Vlad listened to both men in silence, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he turned to his guards and gave his verdict. Pointing to the first monk, the one who had condemned him, he said, "This one has spoken the truth. Let him go in peace." Then he pointed to the second monk, the sycophant who had praised him. "This one," Vlad declared, "is a liar." And he had him impaled on the spot. This story is a fascinating insight into Vlad's psyche. It suggests that he was not a man who craved blind praise or adulation. He had no illusions about the nature of his own actions. He knew his methods were brutal and horrifying. What he demanded was not approval, but honesty. He despised liars and flatterers above all else, seeing them as part of the same moral sickness that he sought to purge from his kingdom. The honest monk, who looked upon horror and called it horror, was spared because he was truthful. The dishonest monk, who looked upon the same horror and called it divine justice, was punished for his deceit. In Vlad's world, even an insult was preferable to a lie. It reveals a ruler with a complex and twisted code of honor, a man who, even while surrounded by the evidence of his own monstrosity, held the truth, however unflattering, as the highest virtue. Excellent. Having terrorized his own kingdom into a state of absolute order, Vlad now turns his attention outward, toward the great enemy that had haunted him since childhood. Part 3 revealed the great enemy war with the Ottomans, 3 Wallachia. For the first few years of his second reign, Vlad was a nominal vassal of the Ottoman Empire. It was a political necessity, a balancing act he had to maintain while he purged the boyars and fortified his power. He paid the annual jizya, the tribute demanded by the Sultan from non-Muslim subjects, a sum of 10,000 ducats. It was a humiliating tax, a yearly reminder of Wallachia's subordinate status, and it must have burned Vlad to send gold to the very empire he despised. But he paid it, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to sever the chains. That moment began to arrive in 1459. The Sultan, Mehmed II, the same man who had conquered Constantinople and who had once been a companion to Vlad's brother Radu during their time as hostages, was preoccupied. He was campaigning in the Black Sea region and dealing with other rebellions. Vlad, ever the opportunist, saw a window. He stopped the payments. For 3 years, from 1459 to 1461, no gold flowed from Wallachia to the Sultan's treasury. This was a quiet but profound act of defiance. It was a declaration of independence written not in ink, but in silence. At first, Mehmed busy with other wars, may have overlooked it. But by 1461, with his other campaigns concluded, his gaze returned to the disobedient Prince of Wallachia. He sent envoys to Vlad's court, demanding not only the payment of the overdue tribute, but also a levy of 500 young Wallachian boys to be trained as janissaries, the elite slave soldiers of the Ottoman army. This demand was a standard procedure for vassal states, but for Vlad, it was the final indignity. He had spent his own youth as a hostage. The thought of sending hundreds of his own people's children to suffer the same fate, to be turned into soldiers who might one day be used to conquer their own homeland, was unthinkable. This was a line he would not cross. The stage was now set for open conflict. Vlad knew that refusing the Sultan's demand was tantamount to a declaration of war. Wallachia, a tiny principality of perhaps 500,000 people, was about to openly challenge an empire that stretched across 2 continents. An empire that had shattered the walls of Constantinople and commanded one of the most powerful armies in the world. From a purely strategic standpoint, it was suicide. But Vlad was not thinking purely strategically. He was thinking of his years in captivity, of his father's humiliation, and of his duty as the son of the dragon. He had forged his kingdom into a weapon through fear and blood. Every impaled thief, every executed boyar, every terrified peasant was part of his preparation for this moment. He had created a society that was disciplined, obedient, and unified in its terror of him. Now, he would turn that weapon against the empire that had haunted his life. The quiet defiance was over. A war of spectacular brutality was about to begin. Having refused the Sultan's demands, Vlad knew that diplomatic niceties were over. The next move from the Ottoman Empire would not be a request, but a threat, and he prepared to meet it with an act of defiance so memorable and so gruesome that it would be spoken of in both the courts of Europe and the palaces of the East. He was about to send Mehmed II a message, not with words, but with a hammer and nails. The Sultan, angered by Vlad's refusal to pay tribute, dispatched another set of envoys to Targovista. This was not a mission of negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Their arrival at Vlad's court was thick with tension. The Ottoman delegates, men of high standing, carried themselves with the arrogance of an empire accustomed to obedience. They strode into Vlad's audience hall, ready to deliver the Sultan's final warning. According to the legend, as they stood before the Wallachian prince, they remained covered, wearing their turbans, as was their custom, and a symbol of their religious and cultural identity. For Vlad, this was a calculated insult. In the courts of European Christendom, it was customary to remove one's headwear as a sign of respect before a sovereign ruler. He saw their refusal not as a matter of custom, but as a deliberate slight, a sign that they did not recognize his authority in his own land. He confronted them, his voice reportedly calm and cold. He asked why they would show such disrespect to him when they would surely uncover their heads before their own sultan. The envoys replied that it was not their custom, that their tradition forbade them from removing their turbans in such a manner. Vlad listened, a faint, chilling smile, perhaps playing on his lips. He responded that he wished to help them strengthen their custom, so that they would never have to break it again. He then gave a command to his guards. The envoys were seized. The soldiers brought forth hammers and small iron nails. As the horrified delegates were held down, their turbans were fixed to their heads, with the nails being hammered directly through the fabric and into their skulls. Vlad is said to have watched the entire procedure without flinching, overseeing the grisly work to ensure his reinforcement of their custom was properly carried out. The envoys, or what was left of them, were then sent back to the Sultan. This act was pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. It was a message of profound and utter contempt. With this single, brutal gesture, Vlad was telling Mehmed II and the entire Ottoman Empire that he did not recognize their customs. He did not fear their power, and he would not bow to their authority. He had taken their symbol of cultural pride and turned it into an instrument of torture and death. There could be no turning back from this. It was a calculated, theatrical, and deeply personal insult to the Sultan himself. The news of the nailed turban spread like wildfire. In the Ottoman court, it was met with incandescent rage. For Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, this was an act of rebellion that could not be tolerated. He began to assemble a massive army, one that would not just punish Vlad, but annihilate him and absorb Wallachia into the empire. Vlad knew this would be the response. He had not stumbled into war. He had invited it on his own terms, with an act of brutality so audacious it left no room for negotiation. The game of tribute and diplomacy was over. The war of the stake was about to begin. Vlad did not wait for the Sultan's retribution to arrive at his doorstep. He was not a man who believed in defensive warfare. He knew that the full weight of the Ottoman army would soon descend upon Wallachia, and his only hope for survival lay in striking first, sowing terror and chaos in the enemy's own lands. In the harsh winter of 1461 to 1462, he launched a daring and brutal campaign of his own, crossing the frozen Danube River and plunging deep into Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria. This was not a campaign of conquest. It was a campaign of terror and attrition. Vlad led his small, highly mobile army on a series of lightning-fast raids against Turkish towns and fortresses. His methods were a terrifying combination of guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics. He and his men would appear out of the winter mists, strike a settlement, and then vanish back into the wilderness before Ottoman reinforcements could arrive. His goal was to cripple the Ottoman war machine before it could even begin its march. He destroyed infrastructure, burning bridges and granaries. He massacred Ottoman garrisons and any collaborators who worked with them. But it was the psychological element of his campaign that was most devastating. He brought his preferred method of justice with him. Every town he raided was left with a grim parting gift, a small forest of impaled soldiers and officials, their bodies left to freeze in the winter air as a gruesome warning to others. He documented this campaign with chilling precision in a letter to his Hungarian ally, Matthias Corvinus. In this letter, he meticulously cataloged the number of people he had killed, providing a grim tally of his work. He wrote, "We have killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, not counting those we burned in their homes or whose heads were not presented to our officials." He even sent the Hungarians bags filled with the severed heads and noses of his victims as proof of his success. This was not the boast of a madman. It was a calculated report from a commander in the field, designed to prove to his Christian allies that he was a worthy and effective crusader, a true shield against the Ottomans. He was demonstrating his value, showing that he was actively weakening the enemy and deserved their continued support. His campaign created a wasteland of terror along the Danube. The Ottoman borderlands, once a secure staging ground for an invasion, were now a chaotic and fearful region. He forced the Sultan to divert resources and deal with the chaos in his own backyard. More importantly, he was sending a clear message to Mehmed II. Invading Wallachia would not be a simple matter of marching an army to his capital. It would be a journey through a land of ghosts and horrors, led by a prince who understood the language of fear better than anyone. As the winter snows began to melt, Vlad retreated back across the Danube, leaving a trail of fire and stake behind him. He had bloodied the nose of the empire. Now, he prepared his own country for the inevitable. Furious response. The news of Vlad's bloody campaign across the Danube, capped by the gruesome evidence of 23,000 dead, reached Sultan Mehmed II not just as a report of a border skirmish, but as a profound and personal challenge. This was not just some rebellious vassal refusing to pay his taxes. This was a direct assault on the authority and pride of the Ottoman Empire, carried out by a man who knew their ways, their lands, and their vulnerabilities. And the Sultan was not a man who tolerated such insults. This was Mehmed the Conqueror. The man who, at the age of just 21, had done what no other ruler had managed in 1,000 years. He had breached the legendary walls of Constantinople. He was a brilliant military strategist, a patron of the arts, and a ruler with immense ambition and a formidable temper. He commanded what was arguably the most powerful and technologically advanced army of its time, equipped with massive cannons that could shatter medieval fortifications. To him, Vlad was a gnat, an annoyance to be swatted. But Vlad's audacious raid had turned that annoyance into a festering wound. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed II marshaled his response. This would not be a punitive expedition led by a provincial governor. This was to be a full-scale invasion, led by the Sultan himself. He assembled an army of staggering size. While historical numbers vary, it is estimated to have been somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, possibly even larger. It was a force 3 to 4 times the size of anything Vlad could hope to muster. This was the imperial army, the same force that had humbled the Byzantine Empire, and it was now being turned, in its entirety, against the tiny principality of Wallachia. Imagine the sight. A city of tents and men, stretching for miles along the southern bank of the Danube. The elite janissaries, the Sultan's personal infantry, disciplined and fearless. The sipais, the heavy cavalry, their armor gleaming in the sun. And the irregular Bashi bazooks, ferocious warriors brought in for plunder and shock tactics. They brought with them the massive siege cannons, the same kind that had broken the walls of Constantinople, ready to turn Vlad's castles to dust. They also brought a fleet of ships to control the river and ferry troops. And at the head of this unstoppable force was Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome. Radu, who had grown up in the Ottoman court and become a favorite of Mehmed, was now a contender for the Wallachian throne. The Sultan's plan was not just to conquer Wallachia, but to replace the defiant Vlad with his more pliable, handsome, and pro-Ottoman younger brother. It was a strategy of both brute force and political subversion, as this immense army began to cross the Danube. Moving into Wallachia, the sheer scale of it must have seemed like the end of the world to the local peasants. It was a force designed not just for battle, but for overwhelming annihilation. Against this tide of steel and men stood Vlad, with his small army of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 composed of loyal mercenaries, a few lesser boyars, and armed peasants. He was hopelessly outnumbered. A conventional battle would be suicide. But Vlad had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. He was not going to meet this army on an open field. He was going to lure it deep into his own dark and haunted land, and there he would fight a war of his own making. As Mehmed's vast army advanced deeper into Wallachia, they found a desolate and unnerving land. Vlad had ordered a full-scale scorched earth policy. The villages they passed were empty, the wells poisoned with animal carcasses, and the fields burned to black stubble. The Ottoman army, a force that relied on foraging and living off the land, found itself marching through an artificial desert. Its supply lines stretched thin, and its soldiers growing hungrier and more demoralized with each passing day. Vlad's small army refused to engage in open battle, instead harassing the Ottoman columns with hit-and-run attacks, striking from the cover of the dense forests and then melting away. But these were just pinpricks, designed to weaken and frustrate the enemy. Vlad knew he needed to land a decisive psychological blow. He needed an act so audacious it would shatter the morale of the Ottoman forces and sow chaos in their command. He decided to target the head of the serpent himself, Sultan Mehmed II. His plan was to launch a surprise attack on the Sultan's camp in the dead of night, find his tent, and assassinate him. On the night of June 17th, 1462, under the cover of darkness, Vlad and a select force of his best soldiers, numbering perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 men, prepared for their suicidal mission. According to some legends, Vlad himself, fluent in Turkish and familiar with the layout of an Ottoman camp from his years as a hostage, disguised himself as a Turkish soldier and infiltrated the camp earlier in the day to pinpoint the exact location of the Sultan's lavish tent. As the Ottoman camp slept, exhausted from their fruitless march, Vlad's forces descended. The attack began around 3 hours after sunset. They moved with terrifying silence, killing sentries without a sound, and then, on a signal, they burst into the camp, torches flaring and war horns blaring. What followed was not a battle, but a maelstrom of calculated chaos. The Wallachians were not there to fight the army. They were there to create panic. They galloped through the camp, slashing at tent ropes, setting fires, and screaming, creating the impression of a much larger attacking force. The Ottoman soldiers, startled from their sleep, stumbled out into a nightmare of fire, smoke, and confusion. They couldn't distinguish friend from foe. In the darkness, Ottoman units began fighting each other, convinced they were being overrun from all sides. Vlad and his elite guard, meanwhile, charged toward the center of the camp, toward the opulent tent they believed belonged to the Sultan. They fought with a desperate ferocity, cutting a bloody path through the chaos. They stormed the tent, but Mehmed was not there. In the confusion of the raid, they had mistaken the tent of 2 high-ranking viziers for that of the Sultan. Though the primary objective of assassinating Mehmed had failed, the raid was a stunning psychological success. Vlad's forces rampaged through the camp for several hours before melting back into the forest at dawn, leaving behind a scene of utter carnage and disarray. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were dead, many killed by friendly fire. The Sultan's army, which had marched into Wallachia with an air of invincibility, had been utterly humiliated. Their commander-in-chief had been vulnerable, their camp had been breached, and their morale was shattered. Mehmed II, it is said, was furious and deeply shaken. The enemy he had dismissed as a minor nuisance was a phantom, a creature of the night who fought by no recognizable rules of war. The night attack at Targovista became a legendary feat of arms. It was a testament to Vlad's incredible bravery and his genius for psychological warfare. He may have been outnumbered, but he had proven that in the dark forests of Wallachia, he was the more dangerous predator. The night attack was the centerpiece of Vlad's strategy, but it was just one element in a relentless campaign of psychological warfare designed to unmake the Ottoman army from the inside out. Vlad knew he could never win a conventional war. He had to win a war of the mind. He had to make the Ottoman soldiers more afraid of the haunted forests and their phantom-like enemy than they were of their own commanders. Every day of their march through Wallachia was designed to be a new lesson in dread. His tactics were brilliantly simple and ruthlessly effective. He turned his own country into a weapon. As Mehmed's army advanced, they found a land that seemed to be actively trying to kill them. The wells they hoped to drink from were poisoned, often with the carcasses of diseased animals, spreading sickness and dysentery through the Ottoman ranks. The fields were black and empty, all crops having been burned, forcing the army to rely on their ever-dwindling supply lines. Small pockets of food that were deliberately left behind were often poisoned, turning a moment of relief into a painful death for the soldiers who consumed it. Vlad also commanded a network of spies and agents who were fluent in Turkish. These men would infiltrate the Ottoman camp, not to fight, but to spread disinformation and paranoia. They would whisper rumors of huge Wallachian armies gathering just over the next hill, of Hungarian reinforcements that were moments away, or of betrayals within the Ottoman command. They would start arguments that escalated into deadly brawls, further eroding the discipline of the Turkish troops. Furthermore, he used the landscape itself to create diversions and illusions. His men would tie branches to the tails of horses and run them through the distant woods, kicking up dust to create the appearance of a large cavalry force on the move. They would light hundreds of campfires at night in an empty valley, making the Ottomans believe they were facing a much larger army, forcing them to remain on high alert and denying them much-needed rest. He also targeted the Ottoman soldiers' humanity, their longing for home. Small groups of Wallachian soldiers, sometimes disguised as Turks, would learn the names of men in the Ottoman camp. In the dead of night, they would creep close to the camp's perimeter and call out to individual soldiers by name, speaking in perfect Turkish, whispering things like, "Why are you here? Hassan, your family in Anatolia misses you. This is not your war." This tactic was profoundly unsettling, making the soldiers feel as if the very forest had eyes and knew their deepest secrets, fostering a sense of isolation and a desperate desire to be anywhere but this cursed land. Every shadow could hold a Wallachian soldier. Every stream could be poisoned. Every sound in the night could be a prelude to an attack. Vlad was waging a war on the Ottoman army's senses and their sanity. He was transforming the familiar rules of engagement into a waking nightmare. He was not just fighting an army, he was haunting it. This relentless pressure was designed to break them down, to make them exhausted, sick, and terrified, long before they ever reached his capital for a final battle. He was preparing the ground for his final, most horrific masterpiece of psychological terror. After weeks of this grueling and unnerving march, the Ottoman army was a shadow of the magnificent force that had crossed the Danube. They were not defeated, but they were deeply wounded, not by major battles, but by 1,000 small cuts. The soldiers were exhausted, their sleep constantly interrupted by alarms, real or imagined. Sickness was rampant, spreading through the ranks from the poisoned wells and the lack of fresh food. Their spirits were low. They had marched for miles through a blackened, empty country, fighting a phantom who refused to meet them in the open field. Sultan Mehmed II, despite his own unease after the night attack, pushed his army forward. He was a proud and determined commander, and he would not be deterred by what he saw as the cowardly tactics of a petty Balkan prince. He believed that Vlad was simply delaying the inevitable. The Wallachian army was small and, in a conventional battle, would be easily crushed. The Sultan's strategy was simple: march directly to Vlad's capital city of Targovist, lay siege to it, and force the final confrontation. Once the capital fell, Vlad's rebellion would be over. So, the weary Ottoman army continued its advance, moving slowly toward the heart of Vlad's kingdom. The land grew quieter, the forests denser. The hit-and-run attacks by the Wallachians seemed to lessen, and an eerie calm settled over the landscape. To some of the Ottoman commanders, this was a good sign. They believed that Vlad's army had finally broken, that his forces had scattered into the mountains, leaving the road to the capital open. They expected to find Vlad and what was left of his army making a final, desperate stand at the walls of Targovista. As they drew closer, about a day's march from the city, they entered a broad valley. The mood in the army was one of grim anticipation. This was it. The campaign of ghosts and shadows was finally coming to an end. Soon, they would face a real enemy, fight a real battle, and claim the victory that their sultan had promised them. They marched forward, expecting to see the banners and fortifications of Vlad's army arrayed before them. But they saw something else entirely. At first, it was difficult to comprehend. From a distance, it looked like a forest, a strange, barren forest of tall, thin tree trunks stretching for miles across the valley floor. It seemed unnatural, too uniform, too orderly for a real forest. As they got closer, the details began to resolve, and a wave of confusion. Then, dawning horror rippled through the front ranks of the army. These were not trees. They were stakes, thousands upon thousands of them, driven into the earth, creating a vast, silent, and grotesque landscape. And on each stake was a body. This was not the aftermath of a battle. This was a carefully arranged exhibition of death, a gallery of torment designed for one specific audience, the invading Ottoman army. Vlad was not waiting to fight them at the gates of his city. He had prepared a welcome for them here, in this valley. This was the site that has echoed down through history, cementing Vlad's name with a terror that transcends time. This was the Forest of the Impaled. It stretched for roughly 3 kilometers in length and 1 kilometer in width. Across this vast expanse stood the stakes, an estimated 20,000 of them, and on each stake was a decaying body, a victim of Vlad's earlier campaign in Bulgaria. These were the Ottoman soldiers, Turkish settlers, and Bulgarian collaborators he had captured and killed. He had not buried them. He had preserved them for this very moment. It was a work of macabre, organized genius. The bodies were not arranged randomly. They were displayed in concentric circles, with the tallest stakes in the center holding the most high-ranking officials and commanders. Their status in death, a grotesque parody of their status in life. The stakes descended in height toward the outer edges, creating a horrifying uniform landscape of torment. Crows and other carrion birds circled overhead, their calls the only sound in the otherwise silent valley. The stench of death, a sweet, nauseating odor, washed over the approaching army, a physical wave of the horror that awaited their eyes. The Ottoman soldiers, battle-hardened veterans who had seen the horrors of war at the siege of Constantinople, were utterly undone by the sight. This was not war. This was something else. This was a vision from hell, meticulously crafted and brought to earth. They saw the faces of their own countrymen, their brothers in arms, twisted in the final agonies of that slow, excruciating death. They saw bodies that had been there for weeks, picked apart by birds, their flesh turning black and leathery in the sun. The sheer scale of it was incomprehensible, the methodical cruelty of it paralyzing. But this spectacle was not truly for the soldiers. It was for their leader. Sultan Mehmed II, the great conqueror, rode forward with his commanders to witness the scene himself. He, a man who had commanded the destruction of cities, was reportedly stunned into silence. He stared at the vast, rotting forest of his own people and understood the message completely. Vlad was showing him that he was not bound by any recognizable rules of warfare or human decency. He was showing him that there was no atrocity he would not commit to defend his land. He was demonstrating that his cruelty was not random, but organized, disciplined, and on a scale that could rival an empire's. In that moment, Vlad was not a prince. He was a force of nature, a personification of resistance so absolute that it bordered on madness. The Greek chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondylas, who documented the event, wrote of Mehmed's reaction. The Sultan, overwhelmed by the sight, reportedly said, "How can we dispossess a man who is capable of such things? He is a man who has a strange understanding of how to rule." The psychological blow was perfect. Vlad had not defeated the Ottoman army with swords or spears. He had defeated their spirit with a single, unforgettable image of horror. He had shown them that to conquer Wallachia, they would have to become as monstrous as he was. And even the conqueror of Constantinople was not prepared for that. Faced with the chilling reality of the forest of the impaled, the momentum of the Ottoman invasion came to a dead halt. The effect on the army was immediate and catastrophic. The soldiers, already weary and demoralized from weeks of hunger, sickness, and guerrilla attacks, were now psychologically shattered. They had come to conquer a kingdom, not to march through a landscape of nightmares. The discipline that was the hallmark of the Ottoman military began to fray, replaced by a pervasive sense of dread and a desperate desire to leave this cursed land. Sultan Mehmed II was a pragmatist as much as he was a conqueror. He assessed the situation with a cold, strategic eye, even as he reeled from the sheer audacity of Vlad's display. He recognized that Vlad had fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. This was no longer a conventional war of sieges and open battles. This was a war against a man who had no limits, who would use any means necessary to defend his territory. To continue the campaign would mean pushing his already broken army deeper into a land where every shadow was a threat and the very earth seemed hostile. Furthermore, Vlad's capital, Targovist, still lay ahead. After witnessing the forest, the Sultan could only imagine what other horrors Vlad had prepared for them there. The city itself had been abandoned by its inhabitants, and the path to it would be a gauntlet of traps and ambushes. Even if he were to successfully lay siege to the city, his army was in no condition to sustain a long and difficult assault. Their supplies were nearly gone, their morale was non-existent, and their will to fight had been left behind in that valley of death. Mehmed also had to consider the bigger picture. His vast empire had other borders to defend, other rebellions to quell. Was this small, impoverished, and horrifically defended principality worth the continued cost in men and resources? He had come to punish a disobedient vassal and install a new, more loyal one. But the price of victory was now clearly higher than he had ever anticipated. And so, the great conqueror made a decision that must have been deeply humiliating for him. He decided to retreat. He acknowledged defeat, not on the battlefield, but in the war of wills. He admitted, in his own way, that Vlad's cruelty was a more effective weapon than his own massive army. He had seen enough. Leaving a portion of the army under the command of Vlad's brother, Radu, with the new objective of winning over the Wallachian boyars through diplomacy and promises of peace rather than brute force, Mehmed II turned his main force around. He marched his weary, haunted soldiers back toward the Danube, leaving Wallachia to its terrifying prince. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable outcome. The tiny, impoverished nation had turned back one of the most powerful empires on earth. Vlad had not won through strength of arms, but through the strength of his own terrifying imagination. He had held up a mirror of horror to his enemies, and they had flinched. As the last of Mehmed's banners vanished across the Danube, an eerie quiet settled over the ravaged Wallachian plains. By all accounts, Vlad had won an impossible victory. He had faced the full might of the Ottoman Empire, led by the conqueror of Constantinople himself, and had turned it back. He had defended his homeland with a brilliant and terrifying strategy, solidifying his legend as a fierce and uncompromising defender of his faith and people. He was the master of his domain, his authority seemingly absolute, his reputation for invincibility now legendary throughout Eastern Europe. But this was a hollow victory, a triumph bought at a terrible price. The land was in ruins. The scorched earth policy that had starved the Ottoman army had also starved his own people. Villages were burned, fields were barren, and the economy was shattered. The population, already small, was diminished further by the fighting and the brutal purges. The very kingdom he had fought so fiercely to protect was now a wasteland, teetering on the brink of famine and collapse. Furthermore, the Ottoman threat was not gone. It had merely changed its form. The Sultan, having failed to conquer Wallachia by force, had left behind a more insidious weapon, Vlad's own brother, Radu the Handsome. Radu, backed by a contingent of Turkish troops and the full diplomatic weight of the empire, represented an alternative to Vlad's brutal rule. He was handsome, charming, and promised a return to peace and stability. This was a tempting offer for the Wallachian boyars who had survived Vlad's purges. They had lived in constant terror of Vlad's unpredictable and absolute justice. Radu offered them a return to the old ways, a chance to regain their influence and wealth under a prince who would be indebted to them and to the Ottomans. They were weary of Vlad's endless war and his iron-fisted control. Radu promised them relief, and many were eager to accept it. So, while Vlad had won the war against the foreign invader, he now faced a civil war against an internal enemy, one led by his own blood. The boyars began to defect to Radu's side, taking their personal armies and their influence with them. The peasants, though perhaps admiring of Vlad's defiance, were exhausted and starving. Their loyalty, once commanded by fear, now began to waver in the face of Radu's promise of peace and food. Vlad found himself in a paradoxical position. He was a celebrated crusader hero abroad, but within his own devastated kingdom, his support was crumbling. He had been a master of controlling his people through fear, but fear is an exhausting tool. The constant state of terror, combined with the hardships of war, had worn his country down. He was the victor, yet he was more isolated than ever, a king ruling over a ruined and increasingly disloyal kingdom. The Forest of Stakes had saved Wallachia from the Sultan, but it had also created the conditions for Vlad's own downfall. The hero who had defeated the giant now found himself slowly being undone by whispers and betrayals from within. The most potent weapon the Sultan left behind was not a garrison of soldiers, but a single man, Radu, Vlad's younger brother. To understand the civil war that followed, we must understand the two brothers, two sons of the dragon who had been forged in the same Ottoman fire, but had emerged as fundamentally different men. Vlad, as we know, was defiant, proud, and filled with a burning hatred for his captors. He endured his time as a hostage, but he never accepted it. He saw the Ottoman court as a gilded cage, and its culture as the culture of his enemy. Every moment there was a lesson in how to one day destroy the empire that held him. Radu was different. He was younger, more adaptable, and, by all accounts, exceptionally charming and handsome, earning him the title Radu Selfrumos, or Radu the Handsome. Where Vlad resisted, Radu assimilated. He embraced the sophisticated culture of the Ottoman court, excelled in its social graces, and became a close friend and confidant of the young Mehmed, the future sultan. Some historical sources even suggest a romantic relationship between Mehmed and Radu, though this is debated. What is clear is that Radu chose a path of cooperation rather than confrontation. He saw the power of the Ottoman Empire not as something to be fought, but as something to be embraced for his own advantage. When Mehmed retreated from Wallachia, he left Radu with a sizable force of Turkish soldiers and a simple, powerful mandate: take the throne from your brother. Radu's campaign was not one of terror and stakes. It was a campaign of promises. He rode into Wallachia not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He went to the weary and terrified boyars and offered them an end to the nightmare. He promised peace with the Ottoman Empire, which meant an end to the devastating wars and a chance to rebuild their fortunes. He promised a return to their traditional rights and influences, a stark contrast to Vlad's absolute and tyrannical control. He promised stability. With Radu on the throne as an Ottoman vassal, the merchants could trade again, the fields could be replanted, and the constant fear of the stake would be lifted. He was, in essence, offering them a return to the old ways that Vlad had so violently destroyed. It was an incredibly effective strategy. The boyars, who had seen their friends and family members impaled, who had been forced into slave labor, and who had lost all their political power under Vlad, flocked to Radu's side. They saw in him a ruler they could control, a man who understood the art of compromise. The country was exhausted. Vlad had demanded impossible sacrifices from his people to maintain a brutal and defiant independence. Radu offered them an easier path, peace and prosperity, at the small price of vassalage to the Sultan. The conflict that ensued was a bitter civil war, pitting brother against brother. Vlad, the master of the open battlefield and guerrilla warfare, found himself losing a war of attrition and political maneuvering. His harshness, once his greatest strength, was now his greatest weakness. The very people he had fought to protect were now turning against him, worn down by his methods and seduced by his brother's promises. Radu's army grew as more boyars defected, while Vlad's forces dwindled. He was being pushed back, cornered, his control over the kingdom slipping away, not to a foreign invader, but to a face that looked so much like his own. As the civil war raged and Radu's power grew, Vlad found himself in an increasingly desperate position. He was losing control of Wallachia. His boyars were deserting him, and his small army was being worn down by the constant fighting. He was cornered, pushed back toward the mountains, his great victory against the Sultan now a fading memory. He had one last hope, one powerful ally he believed he could count on: the Kingdom of Hungary. He sent an urgent appeal to Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. Vlad had, after all, been fighting their shared enemy. His brutal campaign had been waged in the name of Christendom, and he had acted as Hungary's shield, turning back the Sultan's army. He expected that Corvinus would send reinforcements, that the Hungarian army would march into Wallachia to help him crush his brother Radu and reestablish his rule. He expected support. What he received was a betrayal more devastating than any his brother could have orchestrated. Matthias Corvinus was a shrewd and calculating political player. He had his own interests to consider, and those interests had changed. While Vlad's war against the Ottomans had been useful to Hungary, it had also been disruptive. It destabilized the entire region and provoked the powerful Sultan, with whom Corvinus preferred to maintain a fragile peace. Vlad, with his absolute and brutal methods, was becoming a liability. He was too unpredictable, too uncontrollable. Radu, on the other hand, as an Ottoman vassal, offered the promise of a quiet and stable border. Furthermore, Corvinus was receiving reports from the German cities of Transylvania, which were under his protection. The German, Saxon merchants there had long been at odds with Vlad over trade disputes, and they had begun to circulate their own stories about him, painting him as a demonic tyrant who brutally persecuted their people. These stories, which would form the basis of the German propaganda against him, gave Corvinus the political cover he needed. So, when Vlad appealed for help, Matthias Corvinus marched his army toward Wallachia, but not to save him. In late 1462, near Poenari Castle, Vlad went to meet his Hungarian ally, expecting to plan their joint campaign. Instead, he was arrested. The King of Hungary, the supposed defender of the faith and his sworn ally, took him into custody without a fight. The betrayal was total and absolute. Vlad, the man who trusted no one, had been undone by the one alliance he thought was secure. He had fought the Ottomans to a standstill, only to be captured by the Christians he was fighting to protect. He was stripped of his titles and his army and taken as a prisoner to Hungary. His reign of terror, his grand project of building an unbreakable Wallachia, was over. The Impaler, the great and terrible prince, was now a captive once again, his fate now in the hands of the very man who had betrayed him. King Matthias Corvinus now had a political problem. He had just arrested a Christian prince who was famous throughout Europe for his dramatic and successful stand against the Ottoman Empire. To the Pope and the other Christian powers who had been funding a crusade, this was a baffling and treacherous act. Corvinus needed to justify his actions. He needed to transform Vlad from a crusader hero into a demonic monster. And he did so with a new and powerful weapon, the printing press. The justification came in the form of letters, manuscripts, and, most effectively, printed pamphlets that began to circulate throughout the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire. These texts, which came to be known as the German stories, were filled with lurid, sensationalist, and often wildly exaggerated tales of Vlad's cruelty. They were written by his enemies, particularly the German Saxon merchants of Transylvania, who had long clashed with Vlad over trade routes and privileges. Vlad had severely curtailed their economic power and had punished them with his usual brutality when they defied him. Now, with the encouragement of the Hungarian court, they had their revenge. These pamphlets were, in essence, the first true crime bestsellers. The recently invented printing press allowed them to be mass-produced and distributed with a speed that was previously unimaginable. They were filled with stories that we have touched upon: the burning of the poor, the nailing of the turbans, the impaling of dishonest merchants. But they also contained far more fantastical accusations. They claimed he enjoyed dining amidst the groaning bodies of his impaled victims, even dipping his bread in their blood. They told of him boiling people alive, of mothers being forced to eat their own roasted children, and of a sadistic pleasure he took in devising ever more creative forms of torture. These stories painted a portrait of a man who was not just a stern ruler, but a bloodthirsty psychopath, a creature of pure evil who delighted in human suffering. They were a deliberate and highly effective propaganda campaign designed to do one thing: dehumanize Vlad. By turning him into a monster, Corvinus could frame his arrest not as a betrayal of an ally, but as a righteous act of imprisoning a demonic tyrant who was a threat to all of Christendom. And it worked. The stories were incredibly popular. They were read aloud in taverns and marketplaces from Nuremberg to Vienna. The image of Vlad, the heroic crusader, was slowly erased, replaced by the image of Vlad the Impaler, a name he was never known by in his own lifetime. This new narrative took hold in Western Europe and became the definitive version of his life. He was no longer the complex, brutal, but effective defender of the borderlands. He was now a fairy tale ogre, a cautionary tale told to frighten children. This propaganda war was perhaps more damaging to Vlad's legacy than any battle he ever fought. The Ottoman Empire had failed to conquer his body, but with these stories, his enemies in the Christian West succeeded in conquering his name. They created a caricature of pure evil that was so powerful, so vivid, that it would completely overshadow the real, historical man for the next 500 years, laying the dark foundation for an even more monstrous legend to come. With his reputation systematically destroyed by the German pamphlets, Vlad the Impaler, the great defender of Wallachia, vanished from the world stage. He became a prisoner of the very king who was supposed to be his ally. For roughly 12 years, from 1462 until about 1474, Vlad remained in captivity in Hungary. The Crusader prince, the terror of the Ottomans, was now a caged lion. His imprisonment was not, however, the grim, subterranean dungeon experience one might imagine from the tales of his own cruelty. Matthias Corvinus held him under a form of house arrest. He was initially kept at the royal palace in Visegrad, a magnificent fortress on the Danube bend north of Buda. It was a comfortable prison, if such a thing can exist. He was well fed and clothed, likely had access to books, and was treated with the respect due to a man of his noble birth. He was a political asset, too valuable to be mistreated or executed. Corvinus might have needed him again one day, should the political winds shift. During these long years, Vlad was a man without a country or a cause. He could only watch from afar as his brother, Radu the Handsome, ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman puppet. He would have received news of the ongoing skirmishes, of the boyars regaining their power, and of his homeland sinking back into the familiar pattern of vassalage and compromise that he had fought so hard to break. For a man of Vlad's ferocious energy and ambition, this period of forced inactivity must have been a unique form of psychological torture. The world moved on without him. His enemies prospered while he sat, powerless. There are few reliable records of his time in captivity, and the period is shrouded in some mystery. The hostile German stories, however, continued to fill the void. They claimed that even in prison, Vlad could not give up his favorite pastime. One famous tale asserts that he would spend his days catching rats and birds, which he would then meticulously impale on tiny, hand-carved stakes, or sadistically torture in other ways. These stories, almost certainly fabricated, serve to reinforce the image of him as a man pathologically addicted to cruelty, a monster who would practice his evil craft even on the smallest of creatures when humans were not available. Whether he was a model prisoner or a secret tormentor of vermin, these years represent a great pause in his life. The warrior was silenced. The lawgiver had no laws to give. The impaler had no one left to impale. It was a long, quiet decade where the great storm that was Vlad the Dracula subsided into an eerie calm. He was waiting, once again, in the shadow of a foreign court, his fate entirely dependent on the whims of kings and the ever-turning wheel of fortune. While Vlad sat in his comfortable Hungarian prison, Wallachia was returned to the man who had promised it peace, his brother, Radu the Handsome. Radu ruled as a loyal vassal of the Ottoman Empire, and, on the surface, he delivered on his promise. The devastating wars came to an end. The tribute to the Sultan was paid on time. The merchants, both local and foreign, could once again travel the roads without the paralyzing fear of Vlad's justice. The surviving boyars were restored to their former positions of power and influence. The stakes were taken down, and a semblance of normality returned to the land. But the peace that Radu brought was the peace of submission. Wallachia was no longer a defiant shield of Christendom. It was a compliant cog in the vast machine of the Ottoman Empire. The country's policies were dictated not from Targovist, but from Istanbul. Radu was a popular and cultured ruler, but he was not his own man. He owed his throne to the Sultan, and his rule was dependent on the continued favor of his Ottoman masters. This stability, which the boyars had craved, soon began to reveal its own kind of chaos. With Vlad gone, the old rivalries among the noble families reignited. The boyars, free from the terror of the stake, began their plotting and scheming once more. Corruption, which Vlad had ruthlessly eradicated, seeped back into the administration. The country, though peaceful on the surface, was weakened by the same internal divisions that had plagued it for generations. Ironically, the brutal but absolute order that Vlad had imposed began to be missed by some. The common people, who had lived in terror of him, now faced a different kind of uncertainty. Under Vlad, a thief was impaled, but there were no thieves. Under Radu, the punishments were less severe, but the roads were less safe. Merchants who had praised Vlad for creating a land where a golden cup could be left untouched now found themselves being cheated in the marketplaces once again. Radu's reign was not long. He died in the early 1470s, and Wallachia fell back into a familiar cycle of turmoil. A succession of Ottoman-backed rulers came and went, each one struggling to control the treacherous boyars and the rival noble factions. The country became a pawn in the larger games being played by the Ottomans and the Hungarians. This period of instability and weakness did not go unnoticed in Hungary. Matthias Corvinus, who still held Vlad as his prisoner, began to see the situation with new eyes. The quiet, submissive Wallachia under Radu had been useful for a time, but the chaotic and vulnerable Wallachia that followed was becoming a problem. The Ottomans were once again able to exert their influence with little resistance, and the buffer state that was so crucial to Hungary's security was crumbling from within. Matthias began to reconsider the value of his infamous prisoner. Perhaps the demonic tyrant he had locked away was, once again, the only man ruthless enough to bring order to that troubled land. The world without Vlad, it turned out, was not as peaceful as everyone had hoped. So, who was he after all the battles, the betrayals, and the blood? What are we left with, the story of Vlad? Dracula is not a simple one with a clear hero and villain. Instead, it leaves us with a fractured and contradictory legacy, a historical figure who has been claimed by two powerful but opposing narratives. In one version, the one born from the German pamphlets and spread throughout Western Europe, he is Vlad the Impaler, a sadistic monster. He is a blood-drinking tyrant, a man who dined amongst the dead, a fairy tale ogre whose cruelty was so extreme it seemed to defy human reason. This is the Vlad who tortured for pleasure, who saw his subjects as insects to be crushed, a man whose evil was pure, simple, and absolute. This is the monster who would later inspire the most famous vampire in literary history. But in his own homeland, in the folklore and national epic of Romania, a very different figure emerges. Here, he is Vlad Tepes, a stern and sometimes brutal ruler. Yes, but also a national hero. He is remembered as a great patriot, a fierce defender of Wallachian independence, who fought tirelessly against the overwhelming power of the Ottoman Empire. He is seen as a justiciar, a man who inherited a corrupt and chaotic land and cleansed it with an iron will. His brutality is not denied, but it is reframed. It was a necessary evil, the harsh medicine required to cure a sick nation, a tool used to forge a strong and secure state where honesty and order reigned supreme. In this version, the impaled boyars and thieves were not victims. They were traitors and criminals who deserved their fate. So which is the truth? Was he a patriotic hero or a psychopathic monster? The real answer, as is so often the case in history, is likely lost somewhere in the messy, complicated middle. He was almost certainly not the blood-drinking demon from the German stories. But he was also far from being just a noble hero. He was likely a product of his brutal and violent age, a paranoid, ruthless, and brilliant ruler who used terror as a calculated instrument of state policy. He was a man who fought for the independence of his country, but did so using methods that were, even by the standards of his own time, exceptionally cruel. His legacy is a battleground of perception, where the same man can be seen as both a savior and a demon. He is a national icon and a universal symbol of horror. And it is this very contradiction, this inability to be easily defined, that makes him such an endlessly fascinating figure. It is easy to dismiss Vlad's actions as pure, unrestrained sadism, the work of a madman who delighted in suffering. And while a personal inclination for cruelty may have been part of his character, to see only that is to miss the cold, political logic behind the horror. Vlad's brutality was not random. It was a tool, a carefully calibrated instrument of statecraft designed to solve the specific, intractable problems facing his kingdom. Consider the world he inhabited. The 15th century was not a gentle time. It was an age of constant warfare, where power was maintained through violence and fear. Rulers across Europe used torture, mutilation, and gruesome public executions to enforce their will. What set Vlad apart was not necessarily the fact of his cruelty, but its scale, its efficiency, and the systematic way in which he applied it. He took the existing tools of medieval governance and weaponized them to a degree that was terrifyingly effective. His primary problem was centralizing power. Wallachia was a decentralized state, dominated by the boyars, a wealthy, noble class who controlled their own lands and private armies. They were a law unto themselves, constantly plotting and frequently collaborating with foreign powers like Hungary or the Ottoman Empire to increase their own wealth and influence. They had killed his father and brother. To build a nation that could resist the Ottomans, Vlad first had to break the power of this internal enemy. The mass impalement at the Easter feast was a brutal but brilliant solution. It wasn't just murder. It was political surgery, excising the heart of the opposition in one swift, terrifying move. His second problem was fighting a total war against a vastly superior foe. He knew he could never match the Ottoman Empire in soldiers or resources. So, he fought a different kind of war. The Forest of the Impaled was not just a battlefield atrocity. It was a message sent directly to the Sultan. It was psychological warfare on an epic scale, designed to attack the morale and the will of the enemy army. He was communicating that the price of conquering his land would be a descent into a hell of his own making. He turned his weakness, his lack of a large army, into a strength, forcing his enemy to fight on his terms, in a war of terror and attrition. Finally, he used cruelty to forge a new national identity. By eradicating crime with such absolute finality, he created a land of perfect, terrified order. The legend of the Golden Cup is the key here. He was demonstrating that his will was absolute, that his law reached into every corner of society. This brutal social engineering was his attempt to create a disciplined, unified, and productive populace, a nation hardened from within, ready to face the external threat. In his mind, a lazy peasant or a dishonest merchant was a crack in the nation's armor, and he sealed those cracks with blood and fear. His cruelty, then, was a dark and twisted form of nation-building. For 400 years after his death, the memory of Vlad III Dracula was kept alive in two distinct forms. In Romania, he was the hero of folk songs and poems, the stern but just prince who fought the Turks. In the rest of Europe, he was a footnote in history books, a morbid curiosity remembered only for the gruesome German stories about his cruelty. He was a historical figure, firmly rooted in the 15th century. But that all changed in the final years of the 19th century, thanks to an Irish theater manager and part-time novelist named Bram Stoker. While researching for a new horror story, Stoker came across a book about the history of Wallachia and Moldavia. In it, he found a brief passage about a 15th century prince who fought against the Turks and was known by the name Dracula. The book mentioned that the name, in the Wallachian language, meant devil. While this translation was not entirely accurate, it meant son of the dragon. The demonic association was all the inspiration Stoker needed. He had found the perfect name for his villain. Stoker didn't conduct deep research into the historical Vlad. He knew almost nothing of his battles, his politics, or his complicated legacy in Romania. What he latched onto were the German pamphlets, the propaganda that had defined Vlad as a monster in Western Europe. He borrowed the name Dracula and the reputation for extreme cruelty. He combined this with the folklore of the region, tales of blood-drinking spirits and the undead, known as Nosferatu. From this mix of a historical name, a reputation for monstrous evil, and local superstition, he created something entirely new. In his 1897 novel, Dracula, Stoker's character, Count Dracula, makes a direct reference to his supposed past. He boasts of his ancestry, speaking of a time when his family fought against the Turks across the Danube, declaring, "What devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood is in these veins," and speaks of the Dracula race. Stoker was deliberately linking his fictional vampire to the historical warlord, lending his supernatural tale a veneer of historical authenticity. The novel was a success, and its influence was immense. It took the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, stripped him of his context, and transformed him into the archetype of the vampire. The man who fought to defend Christendom became a creature of the night. The prince who impaled his enemies was reimagined as a nobleman who drank the blood of his victims. The complex political landscape of 15th century Wallachia was replaced by the Gothic gloom of a haunted Transylvanian castle. This literary transformation was so complete, so powerful, that it almost completely erased the historical man from popular memory. For millions of people around the world, the name Dracula does not conjure the image of a medieval prince, but the image of a cape-wearing, fanged aristocrat. Bram Stoker did not discover a vampire, he invented one. But by borrowing the name and the dark reputation of a real historical figure, he ensured that Vlad the Impaler, the son of the dragon, would achieve a kind of immortality his namesake could never have dreamed of. And so, today, the ghost of Vlad III, Dracula, walks in two separate worlds. His legacy is permanently split, a perfect reflection of the divided world he inhabited. In the Western world, his historical identity is almost entirely consumed by the fictional vampire he inspired. To say the name Dracula is to conjure images of Gothic castles, bats silhouetted against a full moon, and the elegant, predatory figure of Count Dracula. The man has become the monster. His political struggles, his military campaigns, and his complex motivations are all flattened into a simple, terrifying archetype of evil. He is a horror icon, a Halloween costume, the villain in 1,000 movies and books. The propaganda of his 15th century enemies, filtered through the genius of Bram Stoker, won the war for his international memory. But if you travel to Romania, you will find a very different story. There, Vlad is remembered as one of the nation's great, if controversial, heroes. He is seen as a founding father, a ruler who fought for national sovereignty against impossible odds. His statues stand in public squares, his portrait hangs in museums, and his name is spoken with a kind of grudging respect. Schoolchildren learn of his defiance against the Ottoman Empire, of his strict but effective justice, and of his role in establishing Bucharest. His cruelty is not ignored, but it is seen as a necessary, and perhaps even admirable, trait in a leader fighting for his nation's survival in a dark and brutal time. He is the tough, uncompromising father of the nation. This duality is perhaps his most fascinating and enduring legacy. He is both a national hero and a global monster, a symbol of patriotic defiance and a symbol of supernatural terror. The same man is revered as a savior in one culture and reviled as a demon in another. It serves as a powerful reminder that history is never a single, simple story. It is a narrative, shaped by those who tell it by allies, by enemies, by poets, and by novelists. The real Vlad, the man of flesh and blood, is buried somewhere between these two extremes, under centuries of myth-making and political interpretation. He is neither the saintly hero nor the blood-dipping fiend. He was a man of his time, and his legacy will forever be a battleground between the two powerful stories his life created. And so, the story is over. The man who was Vlad the Impaler is gone, lost to history and transformed by legend. Let the image of the battles, the betrayals, and the stakes begin to fade. Let the noise of his brutal life recede into a distant echo. Instead, let's picture him one last time, not as a monster, not as a hero, but simply as a solitary figure standing on the cold stone battlements of Poenari Castle. The sun is setting behind the jagged peaks of the Carpathian Mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and deep purple. A thick, white mist, the kind that is so common in these lands, rolls up from the valley below, swirling around the base of the fortress, muffling all sound. He stands there, looking out over the endless sea of dark forests that make up his kingdom. The wind is the only sound up here. He is not looking at an enemy or a victim. He is simply watching the night descend upon the land he fought so fiercely to hold. He is a man defined by a brutal age, a man who became a reflection of the harsh, unforgiving beauty of his homeland. His ghost does not haunt this place with anger, but with a profound and endless silence. Let that image be the last one you hold of him, a solitary prince, dissolving into the quiet mists of his own legend. Think now of that valley, the one that was once filled with so much horror, the one they called the Forest of the Impaled. See it in your mind, but see it as it is now. Centuries later, the stakes are long gone, rotted away to dust, reclaimed by the earth. The ghosts of the soldiers have faded, their suffering silenced by time. The valley floor is no longer a monument to death. It is covered in a thick, soft carpet of green grass. Wildflowers blue, yellow, and white grow in peaceful clusters. A gentle stream, the same one that once flowed past the gruesome scene, now murmurs quietly, its water clear and cool as it tumbles over smooth, gray stones. The forest that surrounds the valley has begun to creep back in, its new trees young and vibrant. The sunlight filters through their leaves, dappling the ground in warm, shifting patterns. There is no sign of the horror that once took place here. There is only the quiet hum of bees, the gentle whisper of the wind through the grass, and the peaceful sound of running water. Nature has washed the memory of the violence away. It has taken a place of unimaginable suffering and transformed it back into a place of simple, quiet beauty. The land has forgiven. The land is at peace. Let that sense of peace, of nature's quiet power to heal and reclaim, settle over you. The story we have traveled through tonight was a dark one, filled with cruelty and war. But it is just that, a story. Its time is past. The brutalities of that distant century are confined to the past, sealed away in the pages of history books and the whispers of old legends. We can visit that darkness. We can learn from it. We can try to understand the forces that shaped such a man in such a time, but we do not have to live there. The fear, the anger, the endless struggle for survival, all of it is over. The fires have long since burned out. The cries have faded into silence. The world of Vlad the Impaler is a ghost, a memory that can no longer harm us. Acknowledge the darkness that we have witnessed, and now, consciously, choose to leave it behind. You are safe from it now. You are here, in your own quiet space, far from the haunted forests and the long-forgotten battles. The story is told, and its power over this present moment is gone. Let it all go. Sleep now. The story is finished. The world of the Impaler Prince has faded away, leaving only the quiet of your room. There are no more armies to watch, no more castles to defend. Let all the details, the names, and the dates dissolve into a gentle, formless haze. They are not important anymore. All that is important now is your rest. Feel the weight of your body sinking comfortably into the surface beneath you. Feel the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, a slow and steady tide, in and out. The forests of Wallachia are quiet tonight. The fires have long since burned out, and the only ruler here is the silence. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to see, just the peaceful, empty darkness and the gentle call to rest. Sleep now, rest well.